you ever noticed how there's a lot of people who are farm curious, kind of want to start a farm, but when it comes to actually doing that, kind of stall out? Maybe never get around to it, and if they do, it takes forever. And maybe sometimes we all point and laugh a little bit and say, ha, we knew you didn't have it in you. That's real work, and you're not going to do that. So this video is going to do a deep dive on something I talked about in an earlier video, how the US used to have a career ladder to get into farming, and it doesn't anymore. So if you got here from a previous video and you're just here for the history deep dive, you can skip forward to a timestamp that's going to be around here somewhere. But if you want the whole spiel about why having a career ladder to get into farming matters in the first place and why we should have one and we used to and now we don't and that's a problem, you're in the right place. Stay tuned. So let's get back to why so many people might say, I want to start a farm someday, and why there's so little follow-up, and why nobody wants to work anymore cannot actually explain that gap between lots of people who say they want to farm and how few people actually do. Because I guess I like a good point and laugh as much as anyone else, but there's actually something else way more interesting going on here. There are a lot of people in this country working hard, physically demanding jobs, so no one wants to work anymore is just not the problem. But there are two very real reasons that I might like to try farming someday, rarely leads to someone actually farming. And the first of those is that setting up a farm costs a boatload of money. If you've ever heard that joke about the best way to make $1 million in agriculture is start with 2 million, it's not really a joke. And two, farming is a job where work experience really does matter. You really do need some time working in agriculture to make a proper go of running a farm yourself. And I don't mean like an internship. Unfortunately, it takes a career. My rule of thumb is you might be ready to run a farm yourself if you've been working on farms long enough that you start noticing when other farmers are making mistakes. Because we do all the time. And if you've ever noticed, having a career in agriculture, like being a farm worker, and having a boatload of money don't really happen to the same person. I mean, think about it. Have you ever met a farm worker who's got $1 million in the bank? Me neither. But did you know there was a time in US history when you could work your way up to owning a farm? You could get a job as a farm worker, save money while working your way up on other people's farms for 5 to 10 years, and save up enough money to buy your own place by the end. Now I want to be clear, these were not cushy jobs. They had all the real work and long hours and danger that comes with working on farms, but they actually led somewhere. There was a point to it. And that is the part we need to talk about because that's the part we're missing today. Because nowadays, being a farm worker still has all the hazard and the long hours and the bad pay, but with none of the payoff at the end. In most of the United States, being a farm worker is a dead-end job. And that is the real reason that, quote, nobody wants to work on farms anymore. It's not that people became lazy, the job actually got way worse. And here's the funniest part. If you've ever heard people say things like, well, agriculture used to be progressive. What happened to all those small family farmers with progressive values? Well, this is part of it. That era, the mid to late 1800s to about 1920, just happened to be when there were a lot of poor people who were working their way up to being farmers, back when you could do that. So a lot of the farmers in the US at the time were poor people working their way up. Today's farmers in the US, any way you slice it, are mostly people who inherited their land, their wealth, or both. That's why their political priorities are not about protecting labor. That's why they keep voting against working class interests. They're not working class. I hear so many people act confused about this, and it's wild because it should not be that hard to figure out. The biggest traditional family value that folks are really worried about is passing on family wealth. So here's where that gets hairy. Just because I farm doesn't mean my heirs are going to be willing or able to farm too. And that is one big reason that so many family farms are failing right now. Most of the farms that are disappearing aren't really being forced out of agriculture by financial distress. I know that sounds weird because it's always in the headlines, but if you actually look at the numbers, if you look at the data, and if you know family farmers, that's not what's going on. I even did a video about how when family farms go bankrupt, which sounds really bad, farms have a lot of special safeguards in bankruptcy that the rest of us don't get, which means bankrupt farms usually get back on their feet and go back into business. By the way, if you're liking this video, feel like you're learning something, go ahead and hit like, subscribe, or leave a comment. These things really do tell the algorithm to put the video in front of more people. And if you're really liking it, there's a Patreon down below. So the main reason that so many farms are actually going out of business is not because they're being forced to do it by losing too much money and they go bankrupt and get sold off. That's not what's happening. The main reason they're actually going out of business is by choice. They could keep farming. They could reform their business and start doing things in a way that makes them more revenue. Or they could just sell the land and cash out. And a lot of people just straight up choose to do the second one because it's a lot simpler. And here's my super hot take. I think people leaving farming because they don't want to be there is good. It's fine. I do not believe in keeping heirs farming just because. If it's not for them anymore, they should find something else to do with their lives. That's a good thing. Let's make space for somebody else who does want to be there. We have so many people in this country who want to start farming, and we have a lot of people who have a farm and don't want to be farming. These are two big problems that really should be able to solve each other. But here's the thing that usually gets in the way of that. Who's gonna take over farming when the farm family who's already there is done? Who's gonna buy the land from the farmer that wants out? Let's talk about that real quick, because that is gonna show us why the work your way up to farming career ladder that the US used to have was so important, and why it's even more important now. So here's the deal. If you want to sell farmland today, at today's land prices, it's kind of like selling a house. No broke people need apply. Anyone who buys it from you, the farmer, would have to be someone with money. So who actually winds up buying farms today usually sorts out to roughly 4 kinds of people. 1, real estate developers. 2, a neighbor who is also a farmer, so you wind up with fewer and fewer farms that are bigger and bigger. Number 3, it could be an investment firm, because I did a whole other video about how a lot of our farm policies that are designed to save farmers really just kind of boil down to guaranteed income when you own farmland. Guaranteed return on investment on farmland. And that's why investors want to buy farmland. It's all the policies we cooked up to save farms. If we really want to stop investors from buying up US farmland, there is one known path that works really well, and that is stop trying to save farmers. Stop having handouts, stop having tax breaks. The investors will get bored and leave. And no, it does not destroy agriculture. Other countries have done this. It worked really well. Their farm sectors became a lot more robust after they stopped doing so many pro-farmer policies and subsidies and giveaways. That's a whole nother video. Let me know in the comments if you want to see that. And the last kind of likely buyer for farmland, this one's going to make people mad, but we have to go through it. Number 4, broadly speaking, this is going to be folks who already made a lot of money in a white-collar career somewhere. They want a second career and or enough space for some pet llamas. The thing is, even when folks like this manage to successfully start a small, local, sustainable farm that serves the community, which is lovely, it is still just plain too late in your life and career to build something that's going to be viable long term after you retire, that's able to outlive you. And so a lot of the time, for properties bought by these people, that small farm just winds up being a quick pit stop for a couple of decades on its way to becoming suburbs. It's not really a long-term plan for keeping farmland in production. Also, the sheer cost of starting a farm really does mean that most of the new farms that get started in the US today are this kind of farm. They're second career passion projects by white-collar folks with a baked-in limited shelf life. And that means a baked-in limited ability to impact the food system long-term. If we really want sustainable agriculture to happen, that means we need to be dead serious about how much wealth and career pipelines really matter. And right now, with the way new farms happen in this country, that means the sustainable food movement is kind of counting on mid to late career white-collar passion projects to rebuild the entire US food system. And there are literally just not enough crunchy millionaires out there to make that happen. So we have got to be looking at some other ways to get new people and new talent and new capital into agriculture. Because when you look at it this way, who can actually access farmland? It's really not a mystery why there aren't many new farmers, why the average age of farmers keeps creeping up and staying high, and why existing farms keep shutting down. I wish it were as simple as the usual boogeymen of corporations and agribusiness, and don't get me wrong, those play a role. But there is also the fact that we have failed to build a real pipeline for new farmers to get into the trade and take on the job. That's going to have an impact. And then we have the nerve to act surprised when there aren't new farmers. And it's not for lack of trying either. There are a lot of people working really hard to solve this problem. There's internships, there's training programs. I mean, heck, you've been able to get a 4-year degree in agriculture since at least 1862. There are also millions of people in this country who are working for farmers, who've been putting in the hands-on work to build that job experience for years, if not decades. And that is on top of all the Americans that we know are ready and willing to work outdoor difficult jobs, because they already do, in construction, waste management, emergency services, and more. So not to beat a dead horse, but that argument about how nobody wants to do the hard work of farming anymore is just straight up not true. Plenty of people are willing and able to do the work. Plenty of people are already doing the work. The lack of willing people is just straight up not the problem. So what's missing? Why doesn't all this training and real-life work experience translate into new farmers? Well, a big part of the breakdown is, like it or not, farming is a business. And training is just one ingredient. Businesses also need capital, and this is crucial, the part that everybody keeps missing, a track record. Running a business means you're going to need insurance, and you'll probably need loans. To qualify for both, you need a business track record. People need to know how you perform so they know how much of a risk they're taking on you. And it is a lot easier to sell your crops or livestock, find land to buy or rent, keep good relationships with your neighbors if you already know people and if they already know you. You need to build your professional reputation before you try and start a business, including a farm. So it's a catch-22 problem. To function as a farmer, you've got to have already been farming, which is just another huge reason that people who were born into it have such a huge head start over newcomers. It's not just that they're inheriting land and equipment and other forms of wealth, they're also inheriting connections and can build their business and financial track record on family land before having to strike out on their own. Now, to be clear, this is not to say that every single farm family is good at launching their kids. You just have to talk to some farm kids to figure that out. But for the rest of us, it's not even possible. It's a total non-starter. They have the option of doing that. So for new people, the real missing piece in U.S. agriculture is jobs. Farming needs to be a job that you can get, work for a while, build experience, build savings, and build your track record. Build your professional contacts. And if you think about it, guess what? That is how every single other job works, isn't it? If you're in the trades, you go to school, then you do apprenticeships, then you work for someone else for a while, maybe get to know some customers, and then eventually, if you want to start your own business in plumbing, electrical, you can do that. What you do not do is squirt right out of trade school and start your own plumbing business right away. I hope. And if you're a doctor, a dentist, a lawyer, it's the same thing. You go to school, and then you usually work for someone else for a while who has their own practice. And you work for them. You work your way up, hopefully, to partner, or you can start your own practice once you've got some experience and some debt paid off. And yeah, private equity is breaking that down. That is a whole convo for a different day. The point is, there was and still is a career ladder in these white-collar jobs. If you want to have a profession that is strong and continuing, you need to have a career ladder to get into it. So I just have this wild and crazy idea, which is that farming is a real job. It's a real job. And that means it needs a real job pipeline, just like all those other jobs. And that is not a new idea. In fact, it's a really old one. The US did used to have a career ladder for farming. It was a job that anybody could get, work their way up, and eventually own their own farm. And I want to be clear here, I would not say that career ladder was perfect. The way they did it only worked because they kept taking more land from other people. Classic westward expansion. To make that career ladder work today, the land would have to come from farms that somebody already owns. Which is why, if you think about it, the fact that there are already people in farming who want to get out is a good thing. It is fine. Let them go and let someone new come in to take the place over. I mean, just imagine what would happen if we stopped wringing our hands about farmers leaving the business and let them go. Because people who want to farm but can't get started, and people who are farming and want out, the biggest obstacle isn't even really policy, it's just straight up our mindset. We've been so laser focused on how do we keep farmers in business, and I think that's the wrong question. What we should be asking is how do we get new people in? I was really hoping to get, here's how the farm career ladder used to work, and here's how we can make it work again, all into one video. But once again, it has become clear that that would just be way too long. So for this video, we are just going to do, here's how the US's farm career ladder used to work. And I'm going to put, and here's how we could adapt it to today in a different video. I am going to lay out how the farm career ladder used to work, and you can probably pick out some parts that are not so great. Definitely wouldn't work today, maybe wouldn't have even worked that well back then. Let me know what you see on one side or the other, or both, in the comments. And final disclaimer, I swear, this video is going to focus on white farmers in the North. Now, is that because white farmers in the North were the most important part of U.S. agriculture? Absolutely not. It is because we have so much nostalgia and folklore about that specific part of U.S. farm history. To the point where in U.S. politics, people who want to know better say things like, agriculture just used to be all these progressive small family farms. And you just know that if people are thinking to themselves, farming in the U.S. used to just be little nice progressive family farms, they're just forgetting that the entire South exists and that it is in fact part of the United States. Not to mention California, Hawaii, and the very robust sharecropping economy that was going on for most of the North's farm history. We are now getting into the deep dive portion on what happened to all these progressive and populist farmers. Let's start with a factoid that everybody just knows about agriculture, and that is that it used to all be family farms up in the Midwest and the Plains. Everybody knows this. But it's not true. It didn't used to all be family farms, actually. 1920. 40% of the small family farms in Iowa were actually tenant farmers and sharecroppers. 40%, that's nearly half of all the family farms in Iowa, tenant farmers and sharecroppers. And I think that surprises people because, number one, people who write about agriculture never talk about this because we all just assume that everyone used to be a small family farmer who owned their land and passed it down, and so no one ever fact checks it. But it's not true. And the second reason I think that gets lost is We have really kind of intentionally in US history blurred the line between farmer and farm worker. And the difference between farmer and farm worker honestly could be a whole nother video. Let me know in the comments if you want to see that. But honestly, the difference between farmer and farm worker and how the United States historically has intentionally confused and blurred that line is really, really interesting. But yeah, there's a pretty strong difference between farmer and farm worker, right? There's people who own the farm and there's people who work for the farmer who owns the farm, right? That's a really interesting and distinct line. And the US historically, throughout its history, has done a lot of work to blur that line. Because if you can tell people we have a lot of family farmers in this country, then you can get people to come immigrate, right? And then once they get there, you can make them be a tenant farmer or sharecropper. So, you know, there's a lot of intentional blurring of that line, which helps explain why now we find it so confusing. I'll tell people farmers do this, and people will say, well, don't you mean farm owners? And I'm like, that's what a farmer is. I'll hear people say things like, well, farm workers are the real farmers. Farm workers don't say that. The only people who think that are white Americans who have been intentionally misled for generations on the difference between farmers and farm workers. The farm workers know the difference. That's a digression. That could be its whole own video. But bottom line, the Midwest and the Plains, and especially the Midwest, had a lot of tenant farming and sharecropping. And as someone who does agriculture in the South, I think we kind of have this folklore that sharecropping and tenant farming are things that happen in the South. And that's not strictly true. What really happened is, after slavery was abolished in the South, Southern landowners switched to wage labor. They started hiring back the people who used to be enslaved on their farm and said, I'll pay you instead. And then Southern landowners didn't like that because it turns out if you're paying people for farm labor, they can just go on strike at harvest time and they have bargaining power, and they didn't like that very much. So the South switched to what the North had been doing all along, which was tenant farming and sharecropping. Tenant farming and sharecropping grew out of how Europe did agriculture, which was serfdom. So the northern US and colonies got into sharecropping and tenant farming very early on. Again, that could be a whole nother video. Let me know in the comments if you want to see that. There was an actual insurrection and small civil war against sharecropping and tenant farming landowners in upstate New York about a decade or two before the Civil War. It was like this whole big civil unrest that nobody talks about. That could be a whole nother video. Let me know in the comments if you want to see that. Once slavery was abolished in the South, Southern landowners wanted to find a new way to do captive farm labor, so they adopted tenant farming and sharecropping from the North, where they were already doing that. And then they added a whole lot of Jim Crow to make sure that tenant farmers and sharecroppers had no contractual protections. Another big misunderstanding is that tenant farming and sharecropping happened to black people in the South. By 1920, about half the tenant farmers and sharecroppers in the South were white. So I think a lot of the time tenant farming and sharecropping get used as a euphemism for farming while poor and black. It's not. It is a very specific kind of labor arrangement. And I feel like in a lot of ways, writing it off as this happened to black people gives white people a false sense of security. We need to know our own history better than this. And I think if we'd paid more attention to how farm labor worked back in the day, maybe we would have been less caught by surprise when the gig economy came and started being what it is to us today. Again, that's a whole nother video. Let me know in the comments if you want to see that. Anyway, tenant farming happened in the North a lot to white people, a lot. Now you got to ask, why would people be tenant farmers if they have other options? You're white, you're in the North, there's industry, you can go west. Why are people being tenant farmers and sharecroppers? The answer is money. If you don't have money, you can't buy land. And a lot of the homesteading was not actually free homesteads. Most of the time, if you were going to start a small farm, you had to buy that land. It was a real estate deal. I know we've all heard there was homesteading. You could just go get land for free. Most of the time, that was not true. And most times and places in U.S. history, even if you wanted to go claim land under the Homestead Act for free, you had to make it there 5 years. Well, guess who was most successful at starting a farm and staying there for 5 years? It's people who had money, right? Starting a farm was not a thing for poor people to do, even back in the day. It was overwhelmingly for folks who already had a nest egg from inherited wealth or some other middle class job. And that's how you had the capital to get a prairie wagon and go west. So if you're a poor person in the North who wants to farm and you don't have money to start your own place, what do? You work your way up. There was a thing at the time called the agricultural ladder. So the way the agricultural ladder worked, there were rungs. Wage labor, you just work for pay. There's sharecropping, there's being a tenant farmer, there's getting a mortgage on your own farm, and then there's having your own farm and it's fully paid off. That's the agricultural ladder, right? So let's talk through the steps, all right? You start out as a wage worker. You go work on somebody's farm for an hourly or daily or weekly wage, right? Usually you sleep in their barn or maybe a loft in a log cabin or something. They give you room and board, so they're also feeding you. You just join the family for dinner, and the farm wife mends your clothes. Like, that was a part of the deal. So if you were a farm wife, you're responsible for your household, which included your husband and your kids, but also all the wage workers who were kind of living in your domicile. You had to feed them, you had to fix their clothes, there were people in your care. So the wages for being that kind of farm worker were very, very low, but you also didn't really have any expenses. No mortgage, no food, your clothes were kind of taken care of. So the idea of the agricultural ladder was you do that wage work for a couple of years to save up money to get to the next rung, which was sharecropping. Yay! So as a wage worker, you're kind of on a crew doing tasks as directed by the farmer. As a sharecropper, you have a plot of land that you're responsible for. And the farmer, the guy who owns the place, is providing the seed, the equipment. You're not bringing any equipment into the deal. You are just the guy doing the work. And you're doing it as a sharecropper instead of for a wage. So instead of getting paid a set wage, they'll say, hey, you go farm this piece of land with my equipment. You will get a share of whatever is produced out of that. So the idea is you start having some skin in the game. You had a few years of training when you're working as a wage hand to learn how these tasks are done. And now you're going to be responsible for doing them all the time. You're in charge of that plot of land. And however it produces, that is how much you're going to get paid. So obviously this is nice for the landowner because they don't have to pay you until they get paid. And as the farm worker, it's kind of like your opportunity to make sure that you can actually produce a yield on your own, independently, kind of under your own guidance, using someone else's tools. So you might not make a lot of money, but at least you don't have debt to buy the tools and the equipment. That's the idea. And it's kind of funny too, because if you talk to folks in the Midwest about how they used to have sharecropping, they'll go like, yeah, but it wasn't like the South. It was totally different. Again, the differences between Northern and Southern sharecropping could be a whole video. Let me know in the comments if you want to see that. The kind read, the best case scenario for this is it's a way to split risk between the landowner and a worker who wants to work their way up the ladder, but doesn't have any money to get tools, equipment, etc. of their own. If you do a good job as a sharecropper in the North, you can start saving a lot of money pretty quickly because you didn't have to spend anything on equipment or land. So everything you earn, you do get to keep. And the idea is, as a sharecropper, you can start earning money to work your way up from sharecropping to the next stage of the agricultural ladder, which is tenant farming. So tenant farming, I think a lot of people kind of use it interchangeably with sharecropping, but they're different, okay? As a sharecropper, you don't own any equipment. You get paid strictly on a share of what you are able to produce. As a cash tenant farmer, you are paying cash rent. That's what makes it a tenant. And you're renting the land like you're a tenant, right? As a tenant farmer, you've also maybe bought a horse. You've bought a plow. So you have some equipment that you can start bringing around. And because you've taken on some of that equipment risk and capital, then you can start getting a better deal from the landowners because they don't have to spend as much to have you on their farm working it. So instead of getting a share, you get paid on whatever is left over after you pay for rent, equipment, fertilizer, that kind of stuff. So the idea is, as a wage laborer, you learn basic tasks. As a sharecropper, you kind of learn how to manage the operation. As a tenant farmer, you're starting to get more into the financials of how to run a farm business properly. So the idea with the agricultural ladder is we have a ladder. Even if you have nothing, there's a way for you to get started, save money, and work your way up. That is the ideal of how the agricultural ladder worked. So the next step on the agricultural ladder after tenant farmer is get yourself a mortgage, right? You have saved up enough money as a cash tenant farmer to be able to put down a down payment on some land, and you have a mortgage. And you spend the next several years paying that off. And then once you've paid off your mortgage, you're a fully fledged member of the landowning farming class. That's the ideal. That's the agricultural ladder. And it worked really well for a few decades. As settlement rolls west, you have people kind of going up this ladder as they're moving west. So that was a way that people who were poor could start farming. Here's another funny thing about the agricultural ladder. It also worked for people who grew up on farms, because unless your farm was super wealthy, your dad couldn't necessarily afford to give you a job on the farm, when you came of age. And so the expectation was that even if you grew up on a farm, you don't just stay there for life. You go climb the agricultural ladder yourself and go get your own place. That's how family farms actually worked. So even the people who grew up on family farms didn't necessarily inherit the family farm. Maybe one of the siblings did. If you have farms where everybody's having 10 kids, they can't all inherit the farm, can they? So the agricultural ladder was a way for people who grew up on farms to get themselves their own farm without having to break the farm down into smaller and smaller pieces over the generations. And the agricultural ladder worked great, as long as there was plenty of good farmland to steal. As soon as good land with good rainfall started to run out, the agricultural ladder broke down. Early on in the days of, westward expansion and the agricultural ladder, say the 1840s, somebody could work their way up from wage worker to having a fully paid off farm in 5 or 10 years. It was a real route of upward mobility. But as time went on, more and more of the land was already owned by somebody. I mean, all the land was already owned by somebody. They were just tribes, and the US government didn't recognize their claim to the land. So, take that with a grain of salt. So as farmland got filled up with more and more people that the US government recognized their title to the land, it got harder to buy it. The price of farmland went up, which meant you had to work longer and longer to save up enough money. And the more you worked on that land, the more years went by and the more the price went up. And does this sound familiar? This is exactly what's happening to the housing market right now. It happened to farmers over a century ago, and none of us are ever taught about it because I think we really insist on looking at old-timey farming like it was a golden age when everyone was equal and everything was fine and don't ask any questions. I'm just on an ongoing thing about how if we took farm history seriously as like real financial struggles and like real history instead of like old-timey lore, we would be a lot better prepared to handle modern problems because there is truly nothing new under the sun. Most of the modern problems we're having right now have been played out before in agriculture, and we don't see them because the only way we talk about agriculture is with rose-tinted glasses. All right, so imagine that you were a guy trying to work your way up the agricultural ladder in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and you were seeing all around you that land prices are going up, and you're starting to realize that you might never make it to actually becoming a farmer. You're putting all this work for these other people. You're working other people's land, and you might never actually make it as a farmer. Again, this is very North-centric. A few people in the South were able to climb the agricultural ladder, but it was a lot more difficult. That's another video. If you'd like to see that, let me know in the comments. By the time the 90s start rolling around, the agricultural ladder collapses. If you're trying to work your way up on that thing, it can take you 20 years. That's your entire working life. For a physical job that breaks your body down, that can be your entire career. You have 20 years to make it, and you just spent all of it working for someone else. You've got nothing to show for it at the end. So around 1920, the agricultural ladder breaks down. Because there's also this farm depression that starts in 1920. Speaking of things that could be their whole own video, the 1920s farm crisis. So what happens? A lot of these tenant farmers, sharecroppers, and even farmers who own their own land but are still paying off the mortgage start getting into socialism. They start getting curious about communism because they're starting to see that everything is stacked against them and they're not very happy about it. And the established farmers who already own property, the folks who maybe already had a lot of wealth when they started, freak out. Now this tension has been brewing for decades by this point, and something the wealthier farmers did to kind of keep socialism from fomenting in their area, in their nice Christian agricultural county, was they made sure to keep tenant farmers and sharecroppers moving. They would only let people farm their land for a year at a time. It was kind of an up or out system. They said, you need to save up enough money to go find a new farmer to work with. Right? I'm not going to let you stay here for 2 or 3 or 5 years. So as a tenant farmer or a sharecropper, you had to be constantly proving yourself and showing I am better than all these other guys, marketing yourself, working your way up, and often working your way further west where there was less competition. So you wind up with a lot of competitive pressure. That got interesting. And also the wealthier, more established farmers who have already paid off their land don't want anything to do with communism and socialism. So they start doing a lot of political activism against socialism, communism, what they called Bolshevism at the time. This is kind of funny because I think when people think back on this era, they think progressive farmers. And of course there were progressive farmers, but they were the tenants. The landlords were not progressive at all. They were very, very into the capitalism and quite reactionary and doing everything they could to keep those tenant farmers and sharecroppers and wage laborers on their farms moving too often to ever be able to organize effectively. Eventually things start coming to a head. Not even that is keeping the socialism contained. So what these wealthier landowners start doing is buying farm equipment to replace their tenant farmers and sharecroppers. And it's really funny because, again, this is one of those things when we think about agriculture, our popular memory of agriculture is corporations forced family farms to get tractors and buy each other out. That is not what happened. What really happened is the wealthier farmers started getting tractors to replace labor because the labor was getting a little bit too socialist. So people are always talking about how we replaced horses with tractors. We don't talk about the guy operating those. Let's say just mathematically, right? If a 1 or 2 horse team can only cover 10 or 20 acres, then to farm 100 acres with sharecroppers, you need 5 to 10 guys to operate those horses, right? But if you switch to a tractor, you only need 1 guy to farm those 100 acres. And that 1 guy could be the landowner himself. You don't need to keep a bunch of sharecroppers around anymore. So that switch from horse to tractor, we really focus on the horse to tractor, but there was also a huge labor change in that time. We got rid of a whole bunch of farm laborers. And in many cases, it was wealthier landowners who got those tractors and started doing farm chores themselves that they might have never done back when they were using horses because they had sharecroppers for that. So one of the most fascinating things about U.S. farm history is we have all these books written about how agriculture's changed over the last 100 years or so, and they're almost always written by or about the wealthier landowners. It's people who say, I'm from a family farm and here's what happened. People abandoned farming. The classic sustainable agriculture story of it used to all be small family farms, and then corporations introduced tractors and they forced the family farms to expand and gobble each other up. That is not what happened at all. That is the version of history that wealthy landowners are telling people, because what they actually did is a lot less nice. There was a lot of progressive activism going on in rural areas. They didn't like it very much. They got scared and they replaced those poor working class people who were a little bit too socialist with machines. That's what actually happened. And to see this version of farm history written by the wealthy landowners that says people abandoned agriculture, people don't care anymore, is wild. That is not what happened. Wealthy landowners replaced their own workers with machines. And now they complain that nobody wants to work on farms anymore. No kidding. So that's a very brief history of a part of U.S. agriculture. U.S. farm history is a huge story. We're not going to cover this whole thing in one video essay, but that's a really important part of the story. When people talk about how there used to be progressive farmers and what happened to them, we are missing a huge part of the story. There's no mystery about what happened. Historians have written about it quite a lot. They actually go back and look at the documents, the letters people wrote to each other, the bank records, everything that tells the story of exactly what happened here. But it hasn't made it into pop culture at all. So much of our farm history just comes from farmers kind of repeating what their dad and their grandpa told them, right? And you're not going to tell your kids and your grandkids, yeah, here's how we liquidated labor to consolidate our political power. No one's going to say that to their grandkids. When our understanding of agriculture just comes from basically an oral history that's written by the people who could afford to remain, we are not going to understand what happened at all. So when we talk about there used to be progressive farmers and whatever happened to them, that's what happened to them. To wrap this all up, there is so much going on in U.S. politics right now that's all about authenticity and how family farmers are real and credible and you should listen to everything they say, and they're the folks who really know what's going on. And if you know anything about agriculture and anything about U.S. farm history, they're making a lot of it up. If you want to understand what's going on in U.S. politics, you have to know that this happened. If you want to understand what's happening in U.S. economics, you need to know that this happened. I think if we took this more seriously, so many things in our modern economics, the birth of the gig economy, the fact that no one can afford housing, we've been through all of this before. And if we took it seriously, if we took farming seriously as a business, and the poor people in farming seriously, and what happened to them seriously, then none of this would have taken us by surprise. We could have seen it coming and we could have advocated for ourselves against this surge in housing costs and against the gig economy a lot sooner than we did. We could have gotten out ahead of these things instead of being eaten alive by them like we are right now. So that's my story for you today. Farm history matters, not in the sense of, man, the good old days were so great and we have to get back to that. The things that happened then, the things that rich people did to the poor back then, they're doing again now. The way that we're being told we owe it to family farmers to keep them in business, that's an echo of things they've been doing for a century. It's good for us to know our history, because then maybe we'll have some better ideas, realize we've tried these things before, and be ready for something else. To wrap this all up, we're sold this nostalgic story about how the farming past was simple and intuitive, and it wasn't. Agriculture's always been complicated because it's a real job. It's complicated because real jobs are complicated, and it's always been like that. And that is why when I started making one video about one little piece of farm history, what happened to all those progressive farmers, it turned into a two-parter. And this is now the threequel, and there's going to be a fourth part about, okay, but how do we put this job ladder thing to work for us today? And at this point, there's probably going to be more follow-up videos after that. It's a mini-series now. Agriculture and rural economics don't have to be miserable. They are always going to be hard work, but they don't have to be hopeless. There are so many good livelihoods to be made out here if we can just stay out of the nostalgia weeds and keep our eyes on the prize. And that is making goods and livelihoods for real people who are alive today. Thanks for watching, and y'all do good out there.